Well, good morning. This is Peter Frank, and I'll be leading our discussion today in the Church Online Communications Comprehensive. Now, I am on remote location today, not planned necessarily. I'm actually broadcasting out of my kitchen. At Concordia Publishing House, we had some issues with our air conditioner, and our leadership was kind enough to let us all go home and work from the comfort of our homes rather than the increasingly hot building at the publishing house. So I'm hoping everything is set. Let's see, I hope my audio wasn't bad there. I just muted it. Let me double check one other thing. Okay. Well, I should have, oops. Andrew said he can't hear me. If you can hear me now, please let me know. Obviously, broadcasting from home poses some additional challenges, so we'll see if we've got everything set up there. Pardon me while we just wait and make sure everything is ready to go. I think we're in good shape. So if you are watching and you can let me know if you can hear me okay, just put a quick note in there. Okay, good. Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate it. All right. Well, we'll get going. Like I said, I'm a little off of sorts today because I am broadcasting from home. But I think we're ready to go now. So let me transition back to my presentation, and we'll go through these first few things. So today we are, let me go back. We're in the fourth session of the Church Online Communications Comprehensive. And I'll introduce myself again because that's the next slide. I'm Peter Frank. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Concordia Publishing House in the church supplies area. And I've been with the organization for now 10 years. Yesterday was my official 10-year anniversary. So I'm excited to be here sharing this with you. This has been going really well so far. We've got over 500 people signed up for this comprehensive. And if you're new, if you're one of the 100 of people, I think it was over 100 people now that signed up in the last week, well, you may be asking, what is a comprehensive? Because that's a term that's not real common. So we kind of created it for this course just to serve our purposes. So the comprehensive is a free 14-week online training course covering a topic in great detail, thus the comprehensive name. Now, included in this every week, we'll have a weekly blog post, which I'll show you this week's a little bit later on in the presentation today. You can subscribe to the blog and get these. We'll also send out a summary each week after the live presentation. So we've got a weekly download that goes with it. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. The weekly live video, which you're watching right now. Now, I do apologize. Last week was not a live video. I was actually out of the office, so we recorded it earlier in the week. But moving forward for pretty much the rest of our time, there's going to be maybe one exception. The rest will be live videos. And I'm hoping not all of them will be from my kitchen, but that's okay. So we may be doing a different remote location. I've got a conference I'm speaking at in Chicago, and so I'm hoping to do that from another remote location. That one's really remote, not just down the street from the publishing house. So in addition to the live weekly video, we've got a private Facebook group where we're having some good discussion. We're getting more and more people to join and talk about it. I think that group's over 350 now, which is good. And I've got some questions I'll be posting later on today, hopefully to kind of dig into this topic of personas and profiles in a little bit more detail. So that's what's included in the comprehensive. Again, the videos will be every Thursday at 11:30 Central Time. We start at the beginning of June. We're going to go through the end of August. So hopefully this whole summer will be a great time for you to plan out your communications. And you can watch all the live videos at Facebook at our Concordia Technology Solutions page. But if you've signed up for the course, we'll email you that as well. So like I said, this is the fourth session. We're talking about understanding your church audience. I probably won't do this full introduction moving forward since it's now 4 times that I've done that. We'll just get into the materials later on. So last week we talked about developing personas for your communications. Today we're going to take it a step farther. This is kind of part 2 of the series. And we're going to say, how do you build out the profile so that you can understand your audience more? And actually, speaking of audience, we had a great question on our blog post talking about using the word audience in the church setting. And that, when you refer to audience, especially in terms of worship, that's really just a bad way of describing the congregation. And so to clarify a little bit, we're not talking about audience in terms of a group of people at worship. That, of course, becomes very much a spectator sport, or it seems like that, and worship is not that. You're actively involved in worship. But in communications, audience is an appropriate term because we're talking about it in terms of receiving the message. And it is a little less active, although we do have a lot of back and forth communication. We'll go into that in a few weeks, especially as we get into social media. But at least in terms of what we're talking about today, audience is an appropriate term because it's all about communicating your message and who your subsets of your audiences are. So today, our focus is on making communication more meaningful. And as we dig into persona profiles, that is the goal, is to make them more meaningful. So let's go through, and I am going to be checking our questions as we go. So thank you for those of you who have been posting. I appreciate that you can hear me okay. Good. All right, we're going to dig in. So the outline for today, we're going to do a quick review of what personas are and talk about what we described last week. And again, it's a quick review. We'll talk about why do you develop profiles. Once you have a persona, why do you need to go any farther with it? There's a lot of good reasons. Obviously, we wouldn't dedicate a whole session to this if there weren't. So then, what do you include in a profile? What does that look like? What kind of information do you need? And then how do you go about compiling that information? So we'll describe a few different strategies for that. And this is where I'm really curious to hear how you learn about your audiences. And we'll post that in the group later on today as well. Finally, how do you utilize the personas? Once you've created them, once you've gone through this work of defining your personas and building out the profiles, how do you actually go about using them? So if you saw my live video this morning when I was in the office, I talked about how I have the our persona profiles on a shelf behind me. I should have brought those with me so I could show them off. I'll try to remember to show them in the live presentation next week. But it's important to have them handy because as you dig into it, it's good to always remember and not just do this as a one-time process and then leave it on a shelf, but to actively use it as you go. So that's how we're going to wrap up the discussion today. All right, moving on. So overview of personas. We've got our tiny little person icon there, the circle and the half circle. What is a persona? Well, it's a fictional representation of your target audience. And if you remember from the second session when we talked about goals, your personas become the recipient of your goals. And so you'll have multiple personas within your congregation, within your audiences. And how you divide that up will, how do you choose your personas will be based on what your goals are. So personas are developed to add personalization to your communication. And it allows you to remember that you are communicating with individuals, with people. People are on the other end of your emails and your social media messages. It's not just lists. I know in the marketing world, it's real easy to think about your lists and your email lists and your followers on Facebook, your followers on Instagram. It's easy to think of it just as data and email addresses, but personas help all of us remember that there are real, live, living, breathing people receiving these messages and interpreting it in different ways. And that's what personas help us do, is it helps us group those people who are similar from a variety of different characteristics and let us make the message more meaningful. And as I've worked with my team at Concordia Publishing House, and we've got into personas more, especially on the creative side, that seems to really resonate with them because they're a step removed from our customers. They're not on the phone lines talking with people. It's different in the church where you're actively involved on a day-to-day basis with people. But still, once we get into our offices and once we start doing things, especially digitally, it's easy to forget that we're not talking to groups of people at a time. We're talking one-on-one. And that's where personas kind of draws us back to the fact that we're talking to people. So last week we described how to assign personas, and there's a couple rules that I encourage you to follow. First off, your persona should be general enough that every adult in your congregation should be able to easily be assigned to a persona. And if you remember, we walked through that process in our church management software where you can go through and using dynamic filters assign personas to people until you've got everybody assigned. We'll take a quick look at that later on as we talk about how you research personas and data. But for the most part, we're going to be focused today on just a conversation. But your persona should also be specific enough that they accurately describe how to communicate with those individual members. And as you create these fictional representations of your audience, it becomes really easy. Instead of writing an email to the members of your church, you're writing an email to John. You're writing an email to Sally. It's not to a list. It's not to a group of people. It's one-on-one. And that's where personas really make it much more meaningful. All right, so that's how you assign it. This is the example that we use. And we're not going to dig into this too much, but just as a quick review, we talked about our goals, which in this example were Bible studies, increasing attendance at Bible studies, increasing attendance at Sunday school, focusing on the children separate from the spiritual maturity of the adults. And then kind of outside both of those is the outreach events and hosting a certain number of outreach events at the congregation. And so as we looked at a few different ways of dividing personas, we ended up on these 6. And each one has some very defined characteristics. So like older adult Alice versus 40-ish Fred versus millennial Melody. Those are based more on age. The goal is to get them to Bible studies for the purpose of digging into Scripture, but how you communicate with them is very different. And in this example, we chose to divide them by age. Whereas in Sunday school, while we were focused on parents of young children, we divided it by participation. So Catherine was an active member of the church who has young kids, whereas Robert, we call him returning to roster Robert, is somebody who had been involved in the congregation in his youth and has now begun to return to church. And so that was different. It's not so much based on age or communication preferences, but based on their understanding and their connection to the church, whether it's a current connection or more of a past connection. And then as we started talking about community member Carl, that was grouping all non-members into a specific persona of somebody who is not connected to the church. And we could certainly divide that into additional personas as we change our communication preferences, but we do want to try to limit how many different personas we have. As your goals become more varied, your personas become more varied, and it gets harder to assign. So this was just a simple example. Your congregation is going to be different. Every congregation is going to be different than this. Okay, so now that we've got our personas, why do we go about creating persona profiles? I mean, that process of creating personas is tough enough. It requires some real intentional thinking and research into how do we change our communication based on goals. Well, why do we go to the next step? Well, persona profiles gives your personas a name, a face, a personality, a story. It really makes it personal, a personal persona, if you will. You're kind of seeing that trend as we go. So that's why we build out the personas, and I'll show you, or the profiles, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. But they also, as you build out these profiles, they provide a single reference point of your persona for your team, or if you don't have a team. I know many of you are kind of the team of communications at your church. That seems to be more common than actually having a team of people. But as you think about the church office, your team is not just related to communication specifically, but it could involve the pastor, the office manager, volunteers, even people like the treasurer. You know, everybody's communicating messages. They just happen to be different messages. But having these persona profiles allows you to focus on a single point of communication, a single person that you're communicating with. And as we'll get into more detail, we're going to remind you, these are fictional representations. You shouldn't pick one person in your church to represent that group, but your profiles may tell stories that are familiar to you and other people in your church. And as we've developed personas at Concordia, it was kind of fun as we talked about it that we all had these different individuals from our past, our background in our mind. And while they were similar, of course, they were different. And it became very important for us to focus on that persona profile and not the person in our past, because it kept us on the same page. And that's one of the real values in having these profiles. So also, they provide accountability for better planning and implementation of plans. What I mean by that is, as you build out these profiles, it could be easy to leave them behind and say, well, we're going to focus on this event. Maybe it's a fall festival, and everything revolves around the fall festival and what that means. And if you don't focus on your audiences, you'll start to stray from your goals and why you're doing that event. If everything around your fall festival event, which is meant to be an outreach event, starts to revolve around your members, well, that's really going to change everything that you do and how you communicate. By having that persona that is meant to be a non-member, a person in the community, it draws your attention back to the word choices, to what directions you give. You could say in the front church parking lot, but if you have a back church parking lot and your members haven't been to either, or your non-members, your community members haven't been to either one, I encourage you to think, okay, I need to give more details to that. So that's where these personas come in and provide that accountability for you to always remember who you're communicating with. And it takes it off of the message and puts it on the combination of message and recipient. And that's where having that persona profile just, again, emphasizes that. Okay, so what makes up a profile? Well, here's an example, and this is the example that we're using in our free download, which I'll give you instructions on how to get that later on. You may have already gotten that if you're subscribed to our blog. But a few of the things that go into the structure of the profile. Well, we like to include a photo with that because, it makes it more personal. And this is where stock photos come in real nicely because it's people that you don't know. If you use people from the church, then you're going to associate them with the church. But if you use a stock photo, and there's plenty of great stock photo sites out there, there's plenty of free ones as well. You don't have to spend a lot of money. You're just trying to find something that is a person, but not somebody you know. So we do a photo so that your profile has that personality. We include key facts with it. And so in this example, you'll see up at the top demographic information. And we're going to go into all of these in great detail. You've got demographic information that are just a few things: age, occupation, family. Of course, young adult Andrea is a fictional person, but she's got details as a fictional person. And so we write all that down, document that. There'll be things like scales. And in this example, we have technological skill levels, a scale. You may have something like knowledge of Scripture, or engagement in the outreach ministries, or something like that. Scales are really good if there's a common theme that you want to use to separate your personas, and that depends on what your differentiator is. If your differentiator is participation in the church, your scale may be how many weeks a month do they attend worship. And it could go anywhere from 1 to 4, and that'll tell you how active they are. So scales are a good, quick way to distinguish between your profiles, your personas. We like to include a narrative, and the narrative is kind of the catch-all, but it's a good starting point to tell the story of the persona. And many times you'll find that the examples you use are coming from individuals within your church, and that's okay, as long as the name and the details don't give away who you're talking about. But especially if you're hearing common themes as you're talking with members of your congregation, those would be good things to include because it just gives you that background. It makes the persona more real. After that, bullet points, some key things, and we'll talk about what types of categories you'll want to include. But in this example, we've got like characteristics easily identified by. How are you assigning people to this? Well, you're looking for some of these things like tech savvy and active on social media versus not tech savvy and they don't even know what Facebook is. Things like that. Just quick bullet points that help you describe your persona in more detail. It's important to get this all on a single page, too. You're not writing a novel here. You're not building up a full history. You're giving a snapshot of this person with enough detail to make it real and personal, but again, you're not going to be changing this regularly. It's something to help you communicate. Limit yourself to a single page. And I know that at first you may say, well, how am I even going to get to a single page? I think if your experience is anything like mine, you'll find that as you get going, the first one's difficult. But as you start looking at these differences and building it out and talking with other people in your church, you'll start finding it easier and easier to build out these profiles. And eventually you'll have to scale back. And that's where we ended up. As we limited ourselves to a single page that we can print out and have available, we did have to scale back on all of them. All right, and lastly, if you are using a differentiator between that, so like we talked before in the example, the first one was based on more generations, so older adult versus 40-ish versus millennial. If you have something that differentiates your personas, you could either include that in the name, like we have here, young adult Andrea, or you can include that as a detail. But if you have a single point of differentiation between them, be sure to include that somewhere in your profile so that you can easily jump back to that. Now, as we developed profiles and personas at CTS and Concordia Technology Solutions, our software division, we based it off of two different criteria. So we had, on the one hand, the role within the church. So how we communicate with the pastor is going to be very different than how we communicate with the treasurer. But the other thing that we use is the comfortability with technology, because with pastors, you have a broad spectrum of people from their mid-20s all the way through their 80s, and that's who we work with. And so their technology skill level and their reliance on technology in the ministry is going to be very different in that spectrum. So we took our roles in the church and we split it by tech savviness, as we call it, and split that up. Now, we don't always send different messages to the two different pastors, the tech-savvy pastor versus the non-tech-savvy pastor. But in some cases, it's very important. And as we're describing new features or as we're explaining the value of it, we don't have to explain the value of having access to your data on your phone to the tech-savvy pastor, because he's actively using his phone in his ministry. But for the non-tech savvy pastor, they're going to want to know why you even have a cell phone as you're going out on calls. Isn't that distracting you from the purpose? So that changes the message. And that's just one example as we use that. But we found that was a common theme as we looked at all of our different roles, that how we communicated with them was really based on technology as well as their role within the church. So that's a little insight to how we do it. I could go into more details if you have questions about that. We obviously put a lot of time and effort into developing our personas, and so I do enjoy talking about and explaining that. But as you focus on your personas, you may not have those multiple differentiators, but if you have one, make sure you clarify that. All right, let's get back to the example. And I do apologize. My voice is already starting to go, so I hope it lasts the whole time. All right, so what do we include in the profile? Well, first off, the basics. You include the name. We give everybody a name, and it should be a real name. You shouldn't have your millennial profile, because that starts to depersonalize it. If you want to use that as a descriptor, we recommend that. So that's in our example that we used before, millennial melody. Having something that kind of rhymes, it goes together, helps you remember it a little bit better, but you don't have to do that. But it helps describe the person, and having a real name really just helps you narrow the focus. Now, I will caution you, you may not want to use a name that's a member of your congregation, because people start to think, okay, was this based on that melody? Well, no, it's just a fictional representation of a group. So if you have a larger church, finding names that are not active, names of active members, may be a little bit difficult. And so you may start to get a little goofy with it, or goofy may not be the right word, just a little uncommon common with the names, and that's okay. All right, after the name, you need to share a photo. We talked about that. Figure out a good place to go. There, like I said, there's lots of stock sites. You can just Google free stock photos, free stock profile photos. There's all sorts of stuff there. Most of it will be very businessy. It doesn't really get into churchy type people, but at the church, you're dealing with people in their day-to-day lives, and so that might work a little bit better for you. As we tried to find even a picture of a pastor in a collar, a stock photo of a pastor in a collar, because a lot of our audience is a little bit on the conservative side. We had a lot of trouble finding that, but I think you'll have an easier time. And then you also want to include a biography. This is that narrative that we talked about. Give that background. And as we go through some of these other things, we'll talk about pieces that you might want to include in that. But as you write a biography, give a kind of a timeline. Tell where they grew up, what their involvement in their church was, where are they at now, where do they hope to go, and you just kind of give this timeline of events that is a brief biography, and no more than 2 paragraphs. You're not writing a novel, like I said before. You're just describing a person. And if you can't describe them in 2 paragraphs, you might be making it a little bit more complex than you need to. So that's something to keep in mind. All right. Next, after the basics, demographic information. So what kind of demographic information should you include? Well, that'll certainly vary based on your goals. If one of your differentiators is age, obviously that's going to be something that you want to clarify and share. But there may be many other things. So age is the first thing on our list. You may want to describe family situations. If a key differentiator is the fact that if somebody is single versus married with children, if you have different ministry goals based on that, well, certainly that differentiator should be explained. But even as you describe individuals, and family relationships aren't a differentiator, but they're an important part of it, I encourage you to describe that. And if you don't call that out as a separate line item, maybe you include that in the biography. Background, we talked about that, and it's faith background, but also where they grew up. Somebody who grew up in a rural setting is going to have a different kind of preference for communications, much less understanding of the church, than somebody who grew up in an urban setting. And in the words that they use, their background information there really does change. Home life. What is it like at home? Are they working second shift and their home life is sleeping during the day and working at night and trying to get things done on the weekend? That's going to be a very different kind of thing. And most likely that example will not be common in your profiles. But it depends on where you live. I mean, in some places where you have big factories, that's very common. Whereas other places where it's more of a, urban retail-based environment, that's going to be different. So again, describe the home life of the people and your demographic information. All right, education. Now, this can come up in a variety of different ways. Now, the first thing you might think about in education is what's the degree? Did they graduate high school? Did they graduate college? Are you in an academic area where everybody has at least a master's and very commonly a doctorate? That might be more important to you, depending on your church's goals, than it may be for another church. But in addition to that, think about things like learning style. Based on their education background or based on just their personal background, learning styles may vary from persona to persona. And like we talked about as we went through in the example, if you're dividing by ages, as we're talking about Bible study, the type of Bible study that you'd want to put forth for millennial Melody will be very different from older adult Alice. As Melody went through school, she had videos, she had PowerPoint, she took notes on her laptop. Whereas when Alice went through school, they used typewriters. And that was common up until just a few decades ago, that nobody had computers in schools. And so as you think about like teaching scripture, that'll really vary between those different audiences. So that's where education and learning style really comes into play too. As you talk about communication, Their communication preferences are certainly going to be different, and why they might choose to attend a Bible study based on the way the materials are presented will vary. All right, so that's another thing to look at as you go. The value of education, the background may influence that as well. Different generations have placed different values on education, and that'll definitely affect you in your ministry goals. Sunday school and what is the value of learning Scripture at a young age will vary if education is not, it won't be as important if education in the broad sense isn't as important. So again, that'll vary from church to church. And then lastly, occupation. You'll want to describe what your persona does, just to give you a better understanding of themselves. But that may or may not affect you as you differentiate between your personas. But it'll definitely make it more personal and affect your communication with them, how you write to them. As we go, if you have any questions, please feel free to comment in the Facebook chat. I'm trying to monitor that as I go, so if I start to pause, that's because I'm looking over to see if there are questions. I'm also checking to make sure my audio is still good. But yeah, I'd love to hear what you're thinking, or if you've got other ideas on what to include in the profile. Okay, so the next section, there we go, it's moving forward, technological skill level. And you can call this different things. That's kind of a mouthful there. But really what we're trying to do is describe their comfort with technology. And, the whole point of this course, Church Online Communications Comprehensive, we're talking about digital communications here. And as people are becoming more and more comfortable with technology, that opens up more avenues for communication. But if your audience, your persona, is not comfortable with it, you need to understand that as you're planning out different tactics for communicating, as you're talking with this audience and sharing messages with them, knowing whether they're comfortable looking at things on their phone versus wanting to get it only in the printed newsletter that they receive on Sunday is going to be really important as you go. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Everybody knows that. That's why you're in this course. But also thinking about it from an ability to learn technology. And that's been, I've heard some fascinating stories about how the church can be the one to help the congregation members learn technology, because it opens up new opportunities to share the gospel. And it's also a way, as you find older generations are really eager to learn, more so than ever before, learn technology because it helps in their personal communication, which just, again, further advances the cause of the church, because as they're communicating with their families, they've got this rich faith story, this heritage of faith to share with their family members or friends, and as they can communicate more, they're excited about that. So it all just ties back together. So ability to learn is key, and may influence the kind of tactics that you introduce. Also, device preferences. Now, this is real practical, tangible things. If your persona is on their phone versus on their desktop, that'll change how and where you communicate with them. And it may not eliminate things, although it certainly could. You could use device preference as your persona differentiator. If all things besides that are equal, you may only choose to communicate with one persona via text messages and another through bulletins. Social media accounts. This I recommend putting on all of them. Not that I recommend that every church be involved in every social media channel, but as you develop your personal profiles and you start realizing that nobody in our profiles is on LinkedIn, well, don't spend much time on there then. If your audience isn't there, you shouldn't be there. You're focused on where their attention is, and that's where you should be. So by putting out a lot of social media accounts, and then even if none of them have it, leave it on there just to show that it's blank. It's not an unknown. It's a known that they're not using it. Snapchat's another example. If all of your personas, your personal profile shows that persona is not on Snapchat, which is a small but growing segment right now, well, then you don't need to focus your attention on Snapchat. I'm not saying ignore it. It's important to stay up to date with it, learn how people are using it, but you've got enough things to do that you can't do all things. And as you're cutting it out, it should be based on your personas. So as we went about doing that, I'm using my own example here. We developed our persona profiles and we identified that they're not on Snapchat. And so, at least in CTS, we're not focused on Snapchat right now because that's just not a good place for us to be. Not a good place for us to spend our time and attention. Now, that doesn't mean we're not trying to learn it because our audiences could be shifting there. And that doesn't mean that others in our building aren't using it. Our publicity team is very active on Snapchat and sharing things and trying to reach that audience that is on there, just not our group and our division. So that's where, again, it comes back down to your audience. If they're there, that's where you should be. And so building that into the profile is key to make sure everybody has an understanding. Well, this is why we're not doing it, because nobody that we're communicating with is prioritizing that. All right, next up from there is faith background. And I thought about bringing this up to the very top because it's such a crucial part of your audience and of your members in their lives. But from a communication standpoint, this may not be a key differentiator. In some ways it might be, but at least among your members, they probably have a very similar faith background. Now, as you start looking at non-members and all that, that could change. But from a communication standpoint, it will vary at each church how different the faith background of your personas is. But you could talk about like when they became a Christian. If the majority of your congregation was baptized as a child and grew up in the church, that's going to change things. If you've got some key personas who were became Christians as adults, and joined the church later in life, that's going to change your communication. But I don't know how different it's going to be from church to church. Only you'll be able to tell that. So when they became a Christian, maybe when they became a member, if you're a newer church and you have, maybe you're a mission plant church and you have those founding members who came from your founding church versus those who came afterwards, that may change how you communicate with them. They'll have a different understanding of the goals of the congregation. The importance of faith in their life. Even just because they're a member of the congregation doesn't mean that they are always that they value their faith as much as we may hope everybody does. That could be as you're talking about spiritual maturity, that could differentiate between your audiences there. Instruction. What is their understanding of the church? We had some conversations at my church about adult Sunday school, that we have a number of young adults in our congregation who didn't grow up in the church. And so things like, the common Bible stories, Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark, and that they may know, but some of the other ones they may be less familiar with. And, all of the different things around David's life. They may know about Goliath, and that may be it, but there's so much more there. And so that could change what your strategies are as a church with your church goals, but also how you communicate, that you may provide more context as you're talking about a Bible study about David, than assuming that people know the story and they're just digging deeper. So I think that's a key part as you talk about faith background that may differentiate between your audiences. All right, good. We got some questions. I'll answer those as we get to the end. Thank you for dropping some notes in there. I'm excited to dig into them. A few more things to include in your profile. Church involvement. This goes back to participation levels, so like worship attendance, Bible study attendance, the type of service. What I meant for that was different than what I'm thinking about now, but there's two types of things. So you may have persona profiles that prefer, more traditional worship style versus contemporary. I actually meant as I typed that in and realized that it's kind of ambiguous now, but I meant like the type of service opportunities that they're pursuing. So maybe local versus, foreign, like they want to go on mission trips versus just participate in the community or vice versa. So what their preferences are in terms of how they get involved in the church would be a good way to distinguish between them, although that may not be your differentiator as you go into personas. interests, skills, and passions. Passion's kind of a broad term, but what is really motivating them? And then also, what do they bring to the table? So this is going to be a little bit difficult. This should add some personalization to your personas, although most likely won't be the differentiator. So, what are their interests? Describe that, because it gives you a better idea of who you're talking to. Why are these interests important to the people? That's going to give you a little bit more motivation, and it may change your word choice as you go. That, okay, this persona is motivated by service to others, whereas this persona is motivated by goals and accomplishing things. They're going to be the ones who want to build a building and have something tangible, build that house in Mexico that they can see and talk about, versus the persona who's going to want to build relationships. Those are two very different kinds of communications types. So that's what I mean by why are these interests important to them. What ministries are interesting to them? Goes along with that you may choose not to introduce the new cancer care ministry to people who are interested in tangible results that they can touch and feel. If they are into building, well, cancer care ministries is a long game, and it's very interpersonal, and so that may change that. But again, it's based on the goals of your church, but these are just some things that you may include. Goals, hopes, and intentions. And in this section, while it's broad, I really like this where you can go into. So as you start talking about what their hopes and intentions are, what their goals are, what are they looking for in your congregation? Obviously, the gospel is the key. But more than that, how are they hoping to apply the gospel in their lives? And that just adds some real depth to your persona profiles. Where are they seeking that? So if their goal is to gain a closer relationship within the body of Christ, they need that community. Are they seeking that on Sunday mornings? Are they seeking that during the week? In the evenings, are they looking for that small group? That'll change how you present things to different people as you describe your personas. And that may be a key differentiator too. And why are they there? Ultimately, what caused them to become a member of your church community? Maybe it was just because you're the closest church to their house, but most likely there's a little bit more to it than that. All right, so that is kind of our collection. I'm going to take a quick look at questions, and Kelly's got a great lead-in for me. What's a good way to learn all these details about your congregation as you are assigning members to the personas? That's where we're going next, Kelly, so you're right on there. And Lynn's asking, you may have already addressed that, but do you have a list of typical ages and what that age had? You mentioned that the older Doge had a typewriter that I never thought of. So do you have a typical list or different profiles, or where to get that information? That's a great question. I don't have that readily available because it will vary, but there's some great research out there, and especially within the church context, like Barna Group. They have some wonderful documented research projects that they've done that talk about learning styles or faith backgrounds. You can really get this from a lot of different places. And as we talk about research, I'll give you some good examples of where I had some shortcomings on understanding those things about my church. So let me jump into that, because you guys are right on track with where I'm headed. So that's exciting to see. All right, so how do you compile the data? How do you get this information? There's the question. How do you go about compiling this information, which is almost word for word for what Kelly asked for, so that's great. Well, it's with a lot of research and a lot of intuition. And those things seem to kind of be contradictory. Research is supposed to be non-biased, and intuition is certainly based on your experiences. And that's the exciting thing. I was describing this to one of our team the other day as we were talking about this session, that as we're looking at it at the church level, you all work with the members of your congregation personally, day in, day out. You see them face to face. In a business setting, especially in the marketing world, we're often a step removed from it. And so as we describe personas, it's to help people who aren't interacting with these audiences. Well, as we get into the church world, you guys are a step ahead because you are interacting day in, day out. And so your intuition, your personal experience actually has a much greater impact than what we in the business world tend to have. So let me give you a few examples of where you go for that and how you utilize your intuition. So first off, team meetings. And I want to be careful because I know so many of you are a one-person team. But I mean truly your entire church ministry team. And whether that may just be, you may be the pastor and you just have a part-time secretary who comes in for 4 hours a week to help get the bulletin done. Talking with the people who are leaders in the church, who are actively involved, and just having those conversations of, okay, who is more involved in this ministry versus that one? Why are they there? What are they interested in? Having those conversations, you'll be able to get everybody else's perspective. And while it's most likely you're going to have a very similar understanding, those different views are going to be really key in saying, okay, what did I miss there that they're seeing? Why is it that pastor has this different understanding of our Sunday school families than I? And it's because everybody comes to it with different conversations. But that's really going to be a great opportunity for you to better understand your audiences, even though you may very well know them far better than most people. So team meetings, team discussions, meetings sound so formal. It doesn't have to be formal. It just could be talking about this, actually stating, hey, as we develop these persona profiles, what do you think about this person? This fictional person, what kind of characteristics do you see them as? Those conversations are good. But also informal conversations with your members as you're talking to them and as you're thinking about your persona profiles. This may be the time that you ask the question, well, what caused you to join our church? That may not be a typical conversation question, but as you're thinking it in this context, you can start getting these backgrounds of people that you may have known for years and just never asked these type of questions. And you don't have to go into details. Well, we're developing persona profiles for our communication plan. You don't have to talk about that with them because they may not understand that, or they may have different perceptions of what you mean there. But just asking some of these questions will give you these stories, this background information. All right, so that's another way of doing that. In-person interviews. And this becomes a little bit more formal. And especially in a larger congregation, if you're able to spend a lot of time, I highly recommend doing this. And where you sit down and you talk with somebody one-on-one and you ask a lot of these questions to get to know better. And that was one of the assignments that we did as we were developing these for us the first time. We just called a bunch of churches and had these conversations and said, hey, we're hoping to learn more about our customers. Would you mind if we talked for 15, 20 minutes? And we took notes on it and we shared it with the team, and it was really a good way for us to understand that. In the church, it's going to be a lot easier to do that because you already have these relationships built up, and you say, hey, John, as we're working on this project, I'd love to talk to you about what you think, and you're a good representation of this segment of our church. Would you be willing to help us out with that? And I bet more than often they will say yes, especially if you offer a cup of coffee with that. That seems to be a big player within the church. All right, next up, surveys. And this is one that we utilize probably far too much in CTS, but we get such great information back. So you have probably received a survey from me or somebody else on my team at least once, maybe more than once. If you're new to communicating with us, maybe you haven't had that yet. But we get such great feedback on that. And we try to usually attach a big prize to it just as a thank you because they're so valuable to us. And every year we do our annual technology survey. This year we asked questions about social media preferences. How often are you on each of these different platforms? That gives us a better understanding of our audiences. And we're able to segment it down based on roles and say, oh, well, pastors are here, whereas treasurers are actually spending their time over here. That just gives us a better understanding. And in the church, while it's less common, it is easy to do it. And we've done this a lot at my congregation as we were talking about Bible studies. And what are you hoping to learn in Bible studies? What kind of formats work for you? But you can add questions in there that go back to your persona profiles. And you can say, why did you join the church? Where do you see the congregation going in 5 years? What do you hope to have happen in our church? And you're not going to get on the majority of your congregation to respond. If you do, great. That has not been my experience, but even if you get a segment, 20, 30% to respond, 20 to 30% of your active members, not your whole roster, that'll be great and give you a lot of great feedback. And in those additional notes that you get, those little kind of editorial comments, that's a great way to start building up these backgrounds. Okay, next let me switch back over to the screen. Community monitoring. This is something that, this goes back to one of my, I don't know if I want to call it embarrassing, one of my more discouraging moments, certainly. A couple of years ago now, I got very involved with our outreach group, and there's some great organizations here in St. Louis. Send Me St. Louis is one, and they had an initiative called Serve Boldly, and they had a lot of great training opportunities. And one of them was about community engagement. And so I went to this training session, and one of the things that Matt, who was leading that, talked about, he had this whole questionnaire about the people in your community and the background of your community. And I've been in this community, I've been in St. Louis for 10 years now, recently moved to, we're in Afton, and about 5 years ago, which I guess isn't that recent. But as we went through this, I'd only been here a couple of years, and the questions were about, how did your community get started? What are the members of your community more blue collar, white collar? What's their background? I couldn't answer most of these questions. I realized that even though I'd been in St. Louis for a while, St. Louis is a very, there's a lot of different backgrounds here. You can go from urban to suburban to rural within a 15-minute drive. And so in my specific community here in Afton, I realized how little I knew about the people here. And that was embarrassing, discouraging, but also it opened up some opportunities for me to say, I need to spend more time doing this. I need to understand my audience. If I'm going to help with community outreach, I need to know who's in the community. And so community monitoring, maybe that wasn't the best term to use here. Monitoring sounds so, formal, but participating in areas of your community, whether that's in the church or in your city or town, where you can kind of be an observer of conversations. And one of the things that was suggested to us is, what's the local diner? Where do people go on Saturday mornings to talk? Well, one thing that I've found to be very useful is Facebook groups. There's, at least from an actual community, a local community perspective, there's always going to be a number of groups, and you get kind of a sense for what's going on in people's lives. Now, a lot of it may revolve around crime and, what's this noise? Did everybody else hear that? And that gives you an insight into that as well, that, people are paying attention to what's going on. But it also can give you a unique perspective of what they think about the church, about going-ons in the community and all that. So find places where you can participate or observe those discussions, maybe not as an active participant, certainly not as the leader of the conversation. And that may be, if it's within your church, it may be sitting in the church office when they're compiling the bulletins, or it may be, going over to the preschool and having conversations with the parents as they pick up their kids. Those kind of things where you can, again, you're not leading that discussion, but you are observing and maybe participating in it too. And that's a great way to get that background. So that's another one on there. And the last one that I'll talk about very briefly is database research. And I'm already running short on time. I'd like to keep these closer to 45 minutes. I've already gone over that, so I do apologize. But as you think about database research, we started going into this a little bit last week, and I'm just going to go very briefly back into our Church 360 members database. Let me switch it over here. Last week we talked about developing persona profiles and assigning them to different members in your group. Well, one of the things that's great, once you have this as data within your database, you can build reports off of that. And again, while I'm using our software, this should be pretty product agnostic, meaning that you should be able to go into your database software and do the same thing. And what it may be called something differently, we call it trends. But what you can do is you can build up different subsets of your audience and view their trends. And so while you may want a new trend for, like we have here, attendance of Millennial Melody at worship. If you want to create a new persona and you just say anybody who's a living member who is the persona, we don't want to do any of them, older adult Alice. And we'll save this group as persona older adult Alice. Save that and add attendance at, I think we'll do all calendars and add that. You see, you can compare this over time and see, okay, well, we have more of the Melody persona than Alice attending worship. Actually, yeah, I'll switch that back into worship just so that they're the same. There we go. Now we're up a little bit higher. Alice is actually more regularly attending worship, and while you see from 2014 to 2015 Melody declined and Alice both declined, it wasn't at the same rate. This may not be a great example, but this gives you just this idea that once you understand the data and have that data, you could start pulling information from worship attendance, from giving trends, if that has to do, if you're doing a building campaign as one of your goals, you might be able to distinguish that. So that's the last one on the list. I could talk about that in more detail, but I'm already running out of time. So those are some different ways to compile the data. Once you've built out these personas, then it's important to actually utilize them. And so one way to do that is to identify which personas are receiving each message. And this is where thinking of them as people and not lists really come into play and help you. And if you have this message that you need to communicate and you start looking at your personas and you say, 40-ish Fred is not going to care about this old-timers breakfast that we're hosting at the church that's supposed to be 65-year-olds and up. So I'm not going to send it to them. That's based on age, so that helps me distinguish the message. That's a very blatant way of excluding it. But I know how many emails and newsletter announcements go out about things that don't apply to me or don't apply to others in the congregation that just basically take attention away. And so that's where having these personas really helps you identify and say, nope, Fred's not going to care about that. Another way that these help you is that as you communicate with the persona, not the list, you can become very personal in your messages. And as you add, custom data fields into things too, with mail merge and other things like that, you start communicating with, Fred specifically and say, hi, Fred. I just want to let you know about this new event that's coming up, and you go from there. But we use that all the time. You probably see that in the messages that we send, the emails that we send. It's always, or almost always, hi, and then your first name. It helps us remember we're talking to people, and that if the message is not related to people, and we're thinking of, hi, customer, that just makes it very formal and just informative, but not continuing a conversation. And so that's where persona profiles, again, going back to that persona, not list. All right. Lastly, when the message and the persona are incongruent, and that's a fancy term to just say they don't align, you have to ask yourself, is this the right persona? Is it the right message? And maybe one of those needs to change. As you tie in personas with messages, it becomes very clear that it's, I wouldn't ever talk to older adult Alice about what's happening in the Sunday school preschool class. Like, I don't need to tell her that we need the permission forms for the Christmas service back. Like, that just doesn't make sense. Certainly we need to go to Catherine and Robert about it. Those personas need to hear about it. But I don't need to go to that. And Millennial Melody doesn't even have kids, so I don't need to tell her about that. It really starts to make you realize that, okay, I need to change the message, or I just need to not send it to that audience. And they become very apparent. As we, later on today, I'm filling in and leading a webinar about our product Church 360 Ledger. It's for charting tracking your chart of accounts and processing financial transactions. And one of our personas that we have is church musicians. Well, most church musicians don't spend too much time thinking about chart of accounts, and so we're not going to send it to them unless they have opted into that kind of message. And it's another blatant example of just when it's incongruent. It doesn't feel right. It certainly isn't right. Okay, so in summary, I'm going to wrap up because I'm already at about an hour, and that's far longer than I want to go, but I get excited about these kind of topics, and I could really talk all day. After you've determined your personas, that's really the first step. You build profiles based on your assumptions, based on your intuition, based on what you know, and then you validate those assumptions through conversations, through data research. Those two go hand in hand. You can't have one and not the other and have it work out well. You can't just build profiles based on data, because data may not always be accurate for your church, and you can't build profiles based on assumptions, because you may be influencing that too much personally without actually checking with others or checking with the data. So those two go hand in hand, but I'd start with your assumptions and then validate those with data and validate those with facts. Finalize your profiles. It's okay to go and tweak it as you're not going to start with one, finish it, move on to the next. As you begin to write one, you'll realize, I could include that with the other one, and I can make these really help differentiate between the two profiles, or the 3 or the 4, or however you go. It is an ongoing process, but I would encourage you at a certain point to cut yourself off. And I have this problem as I dig into these projects, as I lead webinars, where I just keep going and going. You have to cut yourself off at a certain point and just say, okay, this is good for right now. We'll review it again in 6 months, or we'll review it again next year during our annual planning process. And then it helps you stick to it. That goes back to that accountability that we're staying with this single message. All right. Lastly, refer to them often. If I was back in my office at work, I would again point to my little foam core printouts of our profiles. I keep them on my shelf, not just because they look cool sitting there, but because we use them on a regular basis. And as I'm chatting with the team and we're talking about something coming up, I'll pull one of those off and say, okay, well, what would she say? What would he say? How would he receive this message? What would she think if we use this word? And it really just helps us focus the message on individuals. So that's the common theme. All right, so that is it for the presentation today. I'm going to show a few things, and then we'll take a look at questions quickly before we sign off. If you haven't already visited our blog today, our part 2 of Understanding Your Church Audience, last time it was Determining Your Church Audience, this time it's Understanding It, goes through a lot of the things we talked about today. And it's just a good recap. It's shorter than listening to this hour presentation, but it doesn't give you all the details I gave today. After that, at the very end, there is a free download, Creating Profile for Your Church's Personas. We'll give the example that I showed in here today, and then a template that you can print out and use within your congregation. Now, it's important to know that this is just a starting point. You can use this exactly as is, or you can go and create your own. And I'd recommend creating your own, because what we put in here works well as a broad example, but your church is a specific church, and you've got specific situations that you're trying to account for. So use that as a starting point. I hope that helps. I'd love to get your feedback on it as well. Lastly, if you haven't joined our group, we've got about 150 people who have signed up for the Comprehensive that haven't joined our Facebook group. I'd encourage you to do that. There's great discussions. Now that I'm back in the office, we're going to be doing more. This last week was a little bit quiet, but we'll have more and more questions as we go. So I encourage you to do that. Next week, please join us as we talk about creating movement in your church communications. And this is a concept that I don't think is in as many churches. It's probably similar with personas that's not real well known. But this is another part that I really love talking about. Because once you start having movement in your congregation and you build that into your church communications, you start getting excitement, and people are always looking forward to the next thing, and there's anticipation, and it just keeps everybody motivated and energized. So that's what we're talking about next Thursday, June 29th at 11:30. That will be a live presentation. It'll be on our Facebook channel, just like this is today, and we will be recording that and sharing that as well. But I encourage you to join us. Here's a quick view at our schedule after that. We've got movement coming up, then focus, context, making the most of each communication channel. All of that's the next 4 weeks, and then beginning at the end of July. And that last one is the one that we may be I will be in a remote location, or it'll be recorded. My plan is to go remote. We're going to get real tactical, building a great website for church communications, and we're going to continue that real practical trend as we get into using your website as a communication hub, utilizing social media, understanding what search engine optimization is. How do you save time in your online communications? And lastly, how do you put this all together, share your excitement with about your communication strategy with your church and your team? So I'm going to put my contact information up on there while I take a look at the questions as we wrap up. And it's looking like not all of the questions are showing. Let me click here and see. Well, shoot, I feel like I'm missing some. All right, well, well, I'll answer a couple quick questions. Only 4 of them are showing. I'm still figuring out this whole Facebook Live thing. It says there's 17 comments and only 4 are showing, and that's kind of frustrating to me. But I'll answer these 4. So Laura's asking, if we don't have Church 360, how do you use these personas in Shepherd staff? Well, I would recommend creating custom fields for personas. You've got a variety of options there. You could make that as a list or a text custom field. And we've got some training that can show you on that. Our support team can help you as well. Although I do caution you, our support team has been kicked out of the building as well due to our air conditioning issues. So if you email that, I know they're monitoring the emails. But they can help you create a custom field so that then you can start creating your lists for this, your list based on that, and subsets of people, and then using that in the reports. So I know that's a very broad overview. The terminology is different, and I'll be honest, I'm not an expert at Shepherd staff as I am with Church 360, but I know the tools are all there for you to do it. Again, you're using personas to create lists, and yes, personas and lists are different, but it's a list of your persona, and then you'll filter that into your reports. And again, it's going to be based on your goals, what you want to look at. So offerings may apply more than attendance, but that's going to be based on you. You may be using it for demographic information too. I know there's a variety of different reports that you can pull based on that. And that kind of leads into the next question from Grace Lutheran Church. How do you take attendance of each and every individual? That is one of my favorite questions to answer. It's a little off base from what we're talking about today. Let me switch back over here real quick, and I'll see if I can find this. I have a blog post. Oops, where did it go? If you go to concordiatechnology.org, and if you go to our resource center, this may take a minute to go. I'm on Wi-Fi here at home. I'm hoping that the connection is strong. And I believe it's in management and under data. We've got a great collection of things up here today. And under here, the value of tracking church attendance and how to do it. This is one of my personally most shared. I get this question all the time, so I wrote a blog post about the value of tracking church attendance and how to do it, and to talk about why and then how do you do it, what are some different strategies, and go through all that. So I encourage you to go take a look at that. It was from last August, but it's still just as valuable today. So Grace Lutheran Church, I encourage you to do that, and depending on which software you use to track your database, it may be a different process than what we use in Church 360 members, but just about every church management software I know can take individual attendance, and that helps you build out your trends. That's why having that data is so valuable. All right, I'm going to switch over to my presentation one last time for my contact information as I get ready to sign out here. Thank you very much for attending today. We'll be sharing this video recording with you later on today, and I hope you have a great rest of the day as you start building out your persona profiles. Thank you.